In the mid-2000s, there wasn't much that could shock first responders in the Illinois city of East St. Louis. The once thriving industrial city had been hit hard by the Great Depression, after which it struggled to recover. From the 1950s onwards, the loss of industry and a declining economy prompted residents to flee in the tens of thousands, leading to a sharp decline in city services and employment opportunities. Many of the remaining citizens lived below the poverty line with little assistance, scraping to get by. Substance abuse and violence were ongoing issues, and the murder rate was more than 10 times the national average. On the edge of East St. Louis lies Frank Holton State Park, a 1,000-acre expanse of woodland, fields, and lakes. With wild deer roaming freely and ample fishing opportunities, the park serves as an urban escape where families can picnic and enjoy the outdoors. For many, it is a place where they can forget their hardships for a few hours. But on the afternoon of Friday, September 15, 2006, paramedics were called to the park after receiving a distressing 911 call. As they pulled up at the entrance at 5:30 p.m., they scanned their surroundings until they found what they were looking for. A young woman was standing still, holding something close to her chest. When they approached, she raised the bundle for them to see. It was a newborn baby, clearly deceased. The woman was taken to the hospital where detectives arrived to take her statement. She gave her name as Tiffany Hall, 24 years old. Tiffany said that earlier that day she had been at the home of a man named Tony, whom she had known for only a few weeks. Without warning, Tony had pinned her down and raped her. She explained that she was 7 months pregnant, and the trauma of the assault had caused her to go into labor prematurely. She gave birth, but the baby girl wasn't breathing. Tony cut the umbilical cord, bundled Tiffany and her stillborn baby into his car, and dumped them in the park. The calm manner in which Tiffany recounted her ordeal suggested to detectives that she was likely in shock. She didn't know Tony's last name and couldn't remember exactly where he lived, but she was able to provide a general description of him, his car, and his house. Using the information she provided, detectives tried to track Tony down. After 4 days with no success, they asked Tiffany to join them and retrace the route she had taken to his house. She agreed, but after 45 minutes of driving up and down streets, she still didn't recognize any of the houses. Back at the station, detectives urged her to recall any further details, but Tiffany became defensive and shut down the questioning, asking whether she needed a lawyer. This wasn't the first time she had been dismissive toward investigators. At the hospital, she had also refused a rape kit. The detectives were aware of Tiffany's troubled background. At 14, she had been charged with domestic battery after kicking her mother and was given a year's probation, which she repeatedly violated. She was eventually sent to a juvenile detention facility for 6 months. By 17, she had given birth to 2 daughters. Her youngest was dropped on her head as a baby, resulting in irreversible brain damage, and child protection authorities later found evidence of physical abuse toward the child as well. Both daughters were taken into protective care but returned to Tiffany 2 years later. Around that time, she was also under investigation for arson after 2 fires broke out in her then-boyfriend's home on occasions when she had been the only one present. 5 years had passed since then, but Tiffany Hall was still on the radar of local police. Just 1 week before she reported being attacked, officers had visited her home to perform a welfare check on her children after receiving a tip about neglect. The father of Tiffany's stillborn baby was her boyfriend, Keith Horn, a Navy sailor stationed 900 miles away in Norfolk, Virginia. Heartbroken by the news, he was granted shore leave to attend the funeral. He arrived at the funeral home on Thursday, September 21st, but as midday came and went, Tiffany was nowhere to be seen. She had called to ask whether the service could be rescheduled, but the director agreed only to wait for her. She arrived about 90 minutes later. A short service was held for the baby, whom she and Keith had named Taylor, and the coffin was taken to the nearby cemetery for burial. As Keith and Tiffany walked away from the grave, she turned to him with a revelation. She admitted that Keith was not the father of the baby. In fact, it wasn't even her baby. After receiving a frantic phone call from Keith Horn, police officers were dispatched to Tiffany's home on North 56th Street, where she lived with her mother and 2 daughters. There was no answer at the door. The house had only one neighbor nearby, with the rest of the property surrounded by a large expanse of trees, dense scrub, and weeds. Based on what Keith had told them, police commenced a search of the property. About 10 minutes in, an officer searching behind the house came upon a disturbing sight. Lying among the thick bushes and weeds was the body of a young woman wrapped in a shower curtain. Damage to the surrounding foliage indicated she had been dragged there from inside the house. Next to her body was a pair of scissors. The young woman had clearly been pregnant, but there was no baby. There was only a large gaping hole in her abdomen. Tiffany Hall and Jamela Tonsl had been close friends since childhood. Though not biologically related, they referred to each other affectionately as cousins. Like Tiffany, Jamela had a troubled upbringing and was considered a social outcast. She was quiet and shy, didn't make friends easily, and carried a large scar across her eye from a car accident that other children mocked her for. Having been placed in foster care at a young age, all Jamela ever wanted was to be part of a stable, loving home. When she became pregnant at 16, the prospect of providing that kind of home for her baby was terrifying. But a month later, her best friend Tiffany announced she was pregnant too. Not only could they raise their children together, but since it would be Tiffany's second child, Jamela could benefit from her experience. In June 1999, Jamela gave birth to a little boy, and a few weeks later, Tiffany welcomed her second daughter. The two supported one another through those early years, sharing meals, taking their children to the cinema, and babysitting for each other. Determined to give her child the best possible life, Jamela persevered through high school as a single mother. In the years that followed, she had 2 more children, worked 2 jobs while attending college classes to become a photographer, and eventually saved enough to buy a car and rent a small apartment. In early 2006, she was delighted to discover she was pregnant for the 4th time. She had come a long way from the scared teenager she once was. She had a job, an apartment, and a loving long-term relationship. She had even rebuilt a good relationship with her own mother. When she considered her 4th pregnancy, Jamela realized there was really only one thing reminiscent of her first. Tiffany Hall was pregnant again, too. The two had remained close into adulthood, and even their mothers had become best friends. But while Jamela was dedicated to her children, Tiffany continued spending most of her time with friends and at parties. Tiffany's daughters were often cared for by their grandmother, while Tiffany sometimes stayed at Jamela's apartment for days at a time. Although she helped around the house during these visits, Jamela sometimes felt that Tiffany was simply using her. By early September 2006, both women were heavily pregnant when they got into an argument over the phone. Jamela decided she needed a break from the friendship and stopped answering Tiffany's calls. Whatever Tiffany wanted to say, Jamela didn't want to hear it. On September 21st, after Tiffany and Keith buried the stillborn baby, Tiffany admitted she had never been pregnant at all. The baby they had just buried was Jamela Tonsl's. Tiffany said she had cut the baby from Jamela's womb before dumping her body in the backyard. When police found Jamela's body, the search for Tiffany Hall began immediately. Her image and a description of the car she was likely driving were released to news outlets while officers went to check Jamela's apartment. They gained access but found each room empty. Investigators also questioned Tiffany's mother, Beverly, who appeared genuinely confused and devastated by the news. It was evident she was telling the truth and had no idea where her daughter could be hiding. A few hours later, Tiffany was traced to a housing project just a few streets from Jamela's apartment and placed under arrest. In her confession, Tiffany explained that it had all started when Keith was deployed. Not wanting him to leave, she concocted a plan, telling him she was pregnant with his child. For months, she faked her pregnancy alongside Jamela's real one, buying baby clothes and toys and sharing the news with friends and family. She knew, however, that her deception would eventually unravel unless she could somehow produce a baby. She confessed to having contemplated taking Jamela's unborn child for quite some time. When the two friends fell out in early September and Jamela stopped returning her calls, Tiffany began putting her plan into action. She bought rubbing alcohol, a pair of scissors, and a nasal aspirator, intending to use it to clear the baby's airway after cutting the child from Jamela's womb. By Friday, September 15th, the two were back on speaking terms. Tiffany had the house to herself and convinced Jamela to come over. At some point during the visit, Tiffany grabbed a chair leg and struck Jamela over the head twice, incapacitating her. She bound her hands and feet with duct tape, and when Jamela struggled to free herself, hit her again, knocking her unconscious. Tiffany then dragged Jamela into the bathtub and used the scissors to remove her baby. Neither Jamela nor the baby survived. Tiffany wrapped Jamela's body in the shower curtain, dragged her into the backyard, and hid her among the bushes. She then took the baby and drove to Frank Holton State Park, where she called for an ambulance. While she was gone, her mother and daughters returned home, unaware that Jamela's body lay hidden only yards away. As detectives were taking Tiffany's confession, they learned that Jamela's 3 other children had last been seen in Tiffany's care and had not been accounted for. Tiffany refused to tell them anything. Missing person posters were quickly produced and broadcast on local news as officers searched every inch of the land surrounding Tiffany's house. Within hours, the search had expanded to Frank Holton State Park. Dozens of officers, firefighters, local volunteers, and sniffer dogs scoured the area on foot. Jamela's loved ones joined the search while mounted police surveyed the fields and divers searched the lake. But as a severe storm approached, bringing heavy rain, strong winds, lightning, and eventually a tornado, the search had to be suspended. It recommenced at first light the following day, with the FBI also getting involved. More volunteers joined in checking vacant houses and dumpsters across the city. Hours passed with no news. Then, at 7 that evening, Tiffany finally broke her silence. Officers had visited Jamela's apartment twice already and had noticed nothing unusual. But based on Tiffany's latest revelation, they entered for a third time. They were immediately struck by a strong odor coming from the laundry. One officer lifted the lid of the washing machine and found the semi-naked body of 7-year-old Deont. Next to it was the dryer. When they pulled open the door, they found the naked bodies of 2-year-old Ivan Jr. and 1-year-old Janela. Police officers wept openly as they lifted the children out and covered them in sheets. Many were so traumatized that they later needed counseling, with one being placed on medical leave. Hundreds of onlookers gathered outside as the children were carried away. The people of East St. Louis had seen more than their fair share of violence and tragedy, yet the murders of the 3 Tonsl children devastated the entire community. Tiffany admitted in her confession that days after killing Jamela and her unborn child, she had gone to Ivan Collins's home and told him that Jamela had sent her to pick up the kids. Ivan had no reason to question it. He knew how close the 2 women were, so he handed the children over and watched as they happily went with their Aunt Tiffany. She took them back to her house, gave each of them a dose of cough medicine to make them sleepy, and drowned them one by one in the bathtub, the same bathtub in which their mother and baby sister had been killed only days earlier. She then wrapped the 3 children, drove the 4 miles to Jamela's apartment, and placed their bodies in the washing machine and the dryer. Autopsies on all 5 victims supported Tiffany's account. Jamela had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, but died from blood loss. The medical examiner described her death as very graphic and very brutal, and confirmed that her baby had not lived to take a first breath. Tiffany Hall was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and the intentional homicide of Jamela's unborn baby. A psychological evaluation found that while she had some unresolved mental health issues and a lower-than-average IQ, she was fit to stand trial. She pleaded not guilty on all counts, and in response, the state prosecutor announced he would seek the death penalty. Tiffany's case was identified as a fetal abduction, a cesarean kidnapping, which is an exceedingly rare crime. It marked only the 12th recorded case of fetal abduction in U.S. history. In each previous case, the abductor was a woman who needed a newborn to pass off as her own, having faked a pregnancy either entirely or after a miscarriage. Most had done so, at least in part, to keep a romantic partner from leaving. While it was clear that Tiffany had killed Jamela to gain access to her baby, she never revealed why she murdered Jamela's 3 living children, nor did she express any remorse. She maintained her not guilty plea for nearly 2 years until June 2008, when she changed her position just before trial was set to begin. In exchange for the death penalty being taken off the table, Tiffany pleaded guilty to all charges. For the 4 murders, she received 4 life sentences without the possibility of parole. For the intentional homicide of Jamela's unborn baby, she received a concurrent sentence of 60 years. Jamela's family expressed satisfaction with the outcome. One cousin said she believed Tiffany should spend the rest of her life in prison thinking about what she had done. Jamela's mother said she had to forgive her and that she believed in putting justice in God's hands. Just over a month after sentencing, Tiffany claimed she had been coerced into her guilty plea and filed a motion to withdraw it. Jamela's loved ones adamantly opposed the move. Her aunt, who said she still loved Tiffany as though she were family, stated that Jamela could not speak for herself, so she would speak for her. Ivan Collins's mother told reporters that Tiffany had massacred a whole family and that before she would ever see that woman walk free, she would go to prison herself. The motion was denied. After the deaths of Jamela and her children, their loved ones faced yet another blow. Neither Ivan nor Jamela's family could afford the cost of a funeral. Word reached the people of East St. Louis, and within days the community had raised $35,000. More than 700 mourners gathered at the church for the service, with Tiffany's mother among them. The pastor urged those in attendance to lean into their faith and to use the tragedy as fuel for change rather than as cause for revenge. After the funeral, Ivan Collins sat beside the graves of his children in tears, clutching 2 white teddy bears that offered no comfort. Consumed by guilt at having handed his children over to Tiffany, he was plagued by nightmares every night. The pain was too great to remain in East St. Louis, and he relocated shortly after, though his guilt followed him across state lines. Every day was a struggle. 2 years passed before he returned to the city, driven by one last thing he needed to do. Jamela's stillborn baby had been buried under the name Taylor, as though she were the child of Tiffany Hall and Keith Horn. On Wednesday, October 8, 2008, the baby girl was exhumed and reburied alongside her real mother and siblings. Ivan told reporters that it was very tough, but that he was happy his family was finally all together. He found comfort in knowing that his daughter was at last buried under her real name, the name he and Jamela had chosen for her long before the tragedy that tore their family apart: Harmony.